Happy Wednesday. We're halfway through the week. We are going to continue our conversation today. And this time we're going to see how those producers, consumers, and decomposers work together or work with each other. What kind of relationship do they have? So, our essential questions today: what is a food chain and food web? And how are the populations in these connected? And then, how does energy move through an ecosystem? So if we remember from yesterday, just as a review, we know that the sun is the main source of energy for everything. Everything on Earth powered by the sun. So if you remember, we talked about an energy pyramid yesterday, and we know that producers are down on the very bottom. They're the base of our pyramid. So producers are going to use the energy from that sun to make their own food. We know that process is called photosynthesis. And we know that producers, P plant. Producers are plants. Producers use the energy from the sun to make their own food. So moving up our energy pyramid, the next three things we come to are our types of consumers. So we have primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary or apex consumers. And if you remember tertiary or apex, they mean the exact same thing. So as our producers are on the very bottom of our pyramid, we move one step up to our primary consumers. Our primary consumers eat the producers, so they are herbivores. They eat the plants, they eat the leaves, the nuts, the seeds, anything that the plant produces, a primary consumer eats. So animals such as cows, insects such as butterflies, and squirrels are also considered primary consumers. If we take another step up on our pyramid, we come to secondary consumers. Our secondary consumers are going to be our omnivores. So they're going to be the ones that eat the primary consumers. So birds, snakes, frogs, all of those are considered to be secondary consumers. And then at the very top of our pyramid, we have tertiary or apex consumers. And those are the ones that eat the secondary consumers. These are going to be your carnivores, the ones that don't have any predators. Animals such as eagles, tigers, lions, those are your tertiary or apex consumers. And then we have decomposers. And decomposers can be woven in anywhere on this energy pyramid. They're going to break down the dead animals and plants and recycle those nutrients back into the soil. So as I was saying, our energy pyramid, we've got our producers as our base, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary is at the very top, and then our decomposers are woven in all throughout the energy pyramid. It's your turn. Drag the icons, the stars, to where they belong. Red, tertiary or apex consumer, green, producer, blue, decomposer, and yellow, a primary consumer. All right, your red star should be over the shark because it is considered a tertiary or apex consumer. Your yellow star should be on the bumblebee because it is a primary consumer. Your green star should be on the picture of the plants because they are producers. And your blue star should be on the picture of the mushroom because it is a decomposer. We are going to watch this Crash Course Kids video about food chains.
Not everybody likes the same kind of food, right? That's probably a good thing. I mean, all the more pizza for me. But whether we eat milkshakes or mangoes, pizzas or pears, tacos or toast, we use the energy that's in our food to stay alive. But how did that energy get into our food in the first place? The answer is that energy flows between living things. It's almost like each form of food is a link in a chain. A food chain. You might have heard that humans are on the top of the food chain because we eat pretty much everything, and except for the occasional video game monster and maybe the odd bear, nothing tries to eat us. But what is a food chain exactly? A food chain is a model that shows how energy flows between living things. You can think of animals and plants in the same food chain as all living in the same neighborhood, which scientists call a habitat. And they all have a job to do, interacting with each other day in and day out. Together, they form a kind of system, a self-contained collection of different things that all work together as a whole. And they also interact with the non-living stuff around them, like the water, the air, the ground, and the sun. Put it all together, and what do you get? A special system called an ecosystem. And food chains show us what eats what in an ecosystem. Now, everything that's alive is in a food chain, including you, my friend. And actually, most living things are in more than one food chain, depending on what or who they're munching on at the moment. I mean, you don't eat the same thing for dinner every night, do you? Didn't think so. Now, let's see how a food chain works by making a diagram of how these interactions happen in nature. First, all of the energy that's in a food chain starts with the sun. I can't stress that enough, people. Plants take the energy from the sun's rays and change it into chemical energy. So when a nice patch of lush green grass starts to grow, it's capturing some of the energy from the sun to do it. Then when an animal, like a rabbit, wanders by and nibbles on that grass, the energy from the plant is transferred into the rabbit's body. Now, if a hungry hawk decides that the rabbit would make a yummy supper, then the energy from the rabbit is transferred to the hawk. And in this ecosystem, nothing is large or brave enough to take on the hawk. I mean, just look at her. So we've hit the top of the food chain, and we've just made a nifty model of it. So a food chain is a model that shows how energy flows between living things in an ecosystem. Energy in a food chain starts with the sun, which is turned into chemical energy by plants. And this energy moves up the food chain as animals eat the plants, and then other animals eat those animals. And speaking of energy, I'm starving, so I'm off to take my place in the food chain. See you next time.
All right. So, just like she said in our video, when we think about food chains, we have to think about what eats what. So a food chain always starts with producers. Now we know that those producers get their energy from the sun, but a food chain is always going to start with some kind of producer, whether it be a plant, a flower, a tree. It's always going to start with some kind of producer. From there, your primary consumer is going to eat the producer. So in this case, we have the grasshopper that's going to eat the plant. Next, our secondary consumers are going to eat those primary consumers. So in our case, the snake is going to eat the grasshopper. And then your tertiary or apex consumers are going to be the one that eats the secondary consumer. So now we have our owl who's going to eat the snake. So we have completed a very basic food chain. But there can always be more than one secondary consumer in a food chain. So again, we're thinking about what eats what. So looking at the very top, we have a 3-link food chain. We have corn. The corn is going to get eaten by the rat, and then the rat is going to get eaten by the owl. Very simple food chain. We have a producer, a primary consumer, and a secondary consumer in this instance. In the very middle, starting with carrots, Now we have two secondary, or we have a producer, which is the carrots. The carrots then get eaten by the rabbit. That's the primary consumer. The rabbit then gets eaten by the fox. That's going to be your secondary consumer. And then the fox gets eaten by the lion. So there's a food chain with 4 links. Now at the very bottom, we're starting with grass. The grass gets eaten by the grasshopper. That's going to be your primary consumer eating the producer. A frog then eats the grasshopper. So there's your secondary consumer. Then a snake or a python eats the frog. There's another secondary consumer. And then finally, the eagle eats the python or the snake. And that is where your tertiary or apex consumer comes in. So always think about the question, what eats what? And then we have decomposers, and decomposers are going to break down any of those leftover parts or waste, and they're going to recycle those nutrients back into the soil. So we know that those decomposers like bacteria, mushrooms, worms, they're going to break down anything that's left over or dead, and also in its poop. They're going to break down that all, and all those nutrients are going to go back into the soil. So now we are going to watch a brain pop video about food chains.
Dear Tim and Moby, are plants always at the bottom of the food chain? From Dwog. In any given ecosystem, all living things are linked together by what they eat. Organisms depend on each other for nourishment to survive, and this joins them together in something called a food chain. In this one lake, there are many different food chains at work. Plant plankton are eaten by small animals, say shrimp. Shrimp are eaten by fish, which are eaten by even bigger fish, until the bears that hang around the lake decide to go fishing. What would happen if we caught every last shrimp in the lake and had a big barbecue? Well, the fish that depend on the shrimp for food would go hungry, and the population would dwindle. And if there weren't any fish, then the bears would go hungry too. Disruptions in the food chain can work the other way too. If all the bears ran off to join the circus, the population of large fish that the bears normally eat would grow out of control. They'd get themselves into trouble by quickly eating all their food. Food chains aren't the whole story. They often combine to form complex food webs containing many interconnected and overlapping chains. A food web has 3 major elements: producers, consumers, and decomposers. Plants make up the bulk of the world's producers. They are able to make their own food using photosynthesis, a process that harnesses the energy of the sun. Producers are the largest part of any food web, and you can find them at the bottom of all food chains. Organisms that eat other living organisms are called consumers. They can't make their own nourishment from sunlight, so they get it by eating the producers. Humans are consumers, as well as birds and cows and millions of other species. Primary consumers eat the producers. Animals that eat plants are examples of primary consumers, and they're also called herbivores. Secondary consumers are the organisms that eat the primary consumers. These are carnivores, or meat eaters. Some animals, like humans, are called omnivores because they eat both meat and plants. There are other kinds of consumers too. Parasites are small organisms that live on the bodies of other organisms, using up the victim's energy. Scavengers eat the carcasses of other dead animals. Decomposers are mostly bacteria and fungi. Decomposers cause the mold that grows on your bread, but they also do all sorts of good stuff like breaking down dead animals and plants into reusable elements and recycling nutrients back into the food web. Humans have to be more careful to protect every species in the world. Just about every species on the planet, no matter how insignificant it seems, is vital to the food web. If even the smallest plant or animal becomes extinct, the consequences will ripple throughout the food web, causing environmental chaos for every species concerned, including us. It's hard to predict exactly what will happen, but one thing's for sure. I don't want to be around if that bear doesn't get his dinner.